After scrounging up parts from the junkyard, we set out to lift the suspension of Rob's Jeep Cherokee, but ran into problems with stuck and broken bolts at every turn.
Oh.
In the previous episode, we only made it halfway through the leaf spring install, so there's still plenty of work left ahead of us.
Jeep day 2.5.
Which we'll kick off by working on the broken driver's side upper shock mounting bolt. The night before, I had started to drill it out.
Got about a quarter inch.
But the bit broke and I couldn't get the pieces of it out. Then I tried to weld on a nut, but it just wasn't working. I ground the weld flat, tried to drill it again, tried to Dremel out the broken bit, and by that point I was completely done with it, so I decided to cut the head off a grade 8 bolt and weld that to the body to act as a stud. No, it's not as strong, but it's one of two, and all it has to do is hold the upper end of the shock absorber, so it's probably fine. All we have to do now is get the lower end in place on the axle.
Do we use the floor jack? I'm almost there!
I don't think I have the strength to go on.
Hey, there you go.
Hopefully, the leaf spring still fits on with that installed. And while we're doing things out of order, let's take a look at the rear brakes.
The brake hose is a little bit too short.
But we have a longer replacement if we can get the old one off of here.
I don't think we could remove this brake hose just looking at the flare nut here.
I think you're just being dramatic.
But even just removing the brake line clip was a bit of a challenge.
That sounded like a brake line.
No.
Leak, leak.
And the hose was severely stuck in its bracket.
Oh no!
There it is.
Remember how you said you shouldn't be driving this without replacing the brake lines?
Yeah.
You were correct.
I don't want to bend it where the rust is.
Which turned out to be difficult as it is quite everywhere.
It's leaking, isn't it?
Well, there's that.
Pretty much as soon as I touched it, the line cracked and started leaking, and it's just as bad all the way up to the front, so we're gonna have to replace the whole thing.
Nobody could have predicted what happened, and somehow the brake line is leaking. It comes up into this splice here, and the rest of these lines look totally fine, so we're not gonna mess with them.
Let's get that joiner disconnected, and keeping the Jeep's brake pedal partially depressed while we work on the braking system will prevent too much fluid from leaking out. Next are the two hard lines on the rear axle that connect to the brake hose. Then we'll disconnect the axle's breather hose by cutting it off of its barb fitting and removing the breather bolt which holds down the brake hose. And once we unclip the ABS wires and the brake line itself, we can remove it entirely from the vehicle.
Hey.
From the peek we got earlier, it's clear that the drums would benefit from an overhaul, but the lines to the wheel cylinders are seized in the flare nuts and we already have enough on our plate, so that's gonna have to wait until later. We were able to break loose the bleeder screws and that's good enough for now. What we are going to have to do is finish up the leaf spring install. So we'll rescue the shackle that we never fully unbolted from the old spring, and using a thoroughly anti-seized intact bolt, reattach it to the body. Then we'll lower the axle to make room for the spring pack.
Tell me when. Tell me when. Oh, dear God, tell me when.
Is that it?
I chickened out, I'm sorry.
We'll get the lift spring in position and bolted to the body before lining it up with the drilled out perch.
What happens if it falls off the jack?
Okay.
Okay.
With that tapped into place, we'll reinstall the U-bolts, U-bolt plate, sway bar bracket, and snug all of that down. Now that both rear spring packs are in place, we were able to fully reconnect the rear sway bar, and the last big thing we need to do back here is install a new brake line and hose.
We have two different options for new brake hoses. This is a standard length, about the same length as the factory one. This is an extended hose. I think it's supposed to be 4 inches longer.
Which looks about right, and that extra slack should give us better angles, so it's the one we're gonna go with.
For raised suspension only. That's you.
To make the brake line itself, we've got a bunch of 3/16 of an inch NICOP tubing.
This episode brought to you by the number 6.
that we're using not just for its corrosion resistance, but for its ease of bending and flaring. The connection to the brake hose uses a 3/8 by 24 flare nut and is a double or inverted flare, which is easy enough and something I am very familiar with making, but
this end in the engine bay is not a double flare.
It is a bubble or ISO style metric flare, which is the same style that mates to the ABS module. The problem is, I didn't actually have a tool to make metric flares, and since it was already too late in the night to go buy one, we decided to call it there. But we both needed to see this thing sitting on the ground. Obviously, since we haven't worked on the front yet, it's got a bit of a rake, but the height at the rear looks pretty good.
We're looking at 34 and 5/8. That's about 6 inches.
And with it back on the ground, we decided to roll the Jeep out of the garage since it would be a few days before we could get back to it.
The parking brake is probably connected. That's all the way. It's as high as it goes.
Well, I guess we gotta adjust that or fix that too.
In the light of a new day, the Jeep is looking pretty promising, and once the front sits as high as the rear, it seems like it'll be a pretty decent height. So, to make our way towards that future, we'll set the body on jack stands and let the axle hang down, which results in an uninspiring show of strength because the doors no longer want to open.
There's a bit of flex in the body there. No! Let's leave that closed.
Moving on and pretending not to notice that, we'll remove the front passenger side wheel, and underneath it, having taken apart the junkyard Jeep, everything looks quite familiar.
We'll do sway bar, shock absorber. The spring will fall right out, probably, and then you can change the lower link.
For the front suspension, we'll kind of be working on both sides at the same time, so once we get the upper and lower ends of the sway bar link loosened on the passenger side, we'll flip to the driver's side and do it again.
I think that one is quick detached too.
Yeah.
Just a few taps later, the front sway bar is fully disconnected. Next, we'll work on the upper shock mounts, and once we get the mounting nut moving, we can grab onto the shield of the shock and spin that to fully unthread it. On the driver's side, the upper mount is underneath the master cylinder, so we decided to remove the airbox lid to give ourselves a bit more room. This time, we'll just clamp down on the shock and impact it loose from up top. Comparatively, the lower ends of the shocks are much easier to remove, and once the bolts are out, the shocks can be compressed and they come right off. Once both have been removed, we'll lower the axle as far as it'll go, which, as it turns out, is pretty much nowhere.
You need to change his lower arms because the stock one is bottomed out right there. That's as low as it could get.
To remove that limiting factor, we'll unbolt the rear and front of the stock arm,
I don't know where that went.
which amazingly comes right out.
Here's that old trailing arm. Here's that fancy one. It doesn't appear to be a left or a right, or even a front or a back.
So we'll get that loosely attached to the body with anti-seized hardware, but the axle side is pretty far off, so we'll save that for later. On the driver's side, we'll impact loose the front and rear fasteners, one of which is stuck, and the other is being awfully stubborn.
They're cutting that bolt really close. Hey!
With that out, we're just left with one, but it doesn't want to budge.
Every time I do that, the rust is raining down from the carpet.
By now, we're all experts on this problem and more than familiar with exactly what's going on here. The difference is that for this particular bolt, we've got a fair bit of room around it, so instead of laying underneath the car and trying to turn this thing forever and ever,
Nope.
how about we take a different approach? This is a ball joint press, and it can apply a ton of force, so if anything is going to get that bolt moving, this should be it.
It moved a little.
But even with the power of the press, that bolt still really doesn't want to leave. And even with the bolt pushed out a full inch, it is still way too stuck to turn with a wrench. Since the bolt is now flush with its mount, we're going to need to extend the press, and this 7/16 of an inch grade 5 bolt should do the trick. Or maybe not.
Oh my god. That's a lot of force.
Whoa!
It seems like the press has done about as much as it can, so now we're going to change tactics.
If we try to torch it, it's going to melt the rubber, and then the sleeve is still going to be welded to the bolt. I don't think we could get it out, so I think the best bet is just to cut the bolt off.
This time we'll use a cutting disc on an angle grinder, which will be much better for dealing with the hardened steel bolt. And once that's most of the way through, we can snap the head of the bolt off.
There it is.
Now the trailing arm is mostly free, and by prying apart the mount and pulling downwards, we should be able to fully remove it.
Get that crap out of here.
Which makes room for the new aftermarket arm. For the moment, we'll leave that hanging from the mount on the body while we remove the factory coil springs. Starting on the passenger side, we'll remove this bracket holding the speed sensor wire so that we can get to this hold down that locks the coil spring to its perch. Then, with just a shove downwards on the axle, we can pull the spring right off. The difference in length between the factory coil and the lift one is immediately obvious, with the one from the junkyard measuring about 2 inches taller and the coils are a bit thicker. This taller spring is going to require us to push the axle down farther, and to keep from stressing the brake hose while doing this, we'll go ahead and remove the caliper. With that supported and set aside, we were able to push the axle way down and get the spring installed fairly easily. Then, with the axle lifted up a bit, we'll reinstall the hold down to make sure it stays in place. Over on the driver's side, we'll repeat the same process, and pretty soon we've got both lift springs in place over the front axle. As it turns out, the speed sensor wires are a little bit too short mounted in the original orientation, but if you simply pop them out of this upper bracket and reinstall them upside down, they seem to have plenty of slack. And although right now the brake hoses are pretty much maxed out, it looks like once the shocks are installed, they should be fine. All good news, so let's finish the install of our new trailing arms by attaching them to the axle. With a bit of wiggling, we were able to get the bolt in on the driver's side, but the passenger side still needs to come pretty far forward. We ended up removing the bolt from the rear of the trailing arm and hanging it from the axle instead, so that we could more easily pull forward on the axle and pry forward on the trailing arm to get that bolt hole lined up.
Got the tip. There, we're done. Drive it home. We're good to go.
What ended up working was threading in a temporary bolt on the outside to keep that lined up while we started the real bolt on the inside.
Got it. Well, that's never coming out.
Nope, that's never coming out again.
Never again.
With that snugged down, the axle is finally held in position, so let's see if we can get the sway bar end links sorted out.
And there's the factory sway bar end link. This is the fancy one. It's extended, but it can also be disconnected by removing these pins in the center section, which is pretty cool.
Thinking that it might be easier, we'll install these one piece at a time on each side of the vehicle. With the ends of the links loosely bolted in, we'll slot in these central sections and pin them in place. With those assembled, the last major parts that need to go back on the front end are the shocks. The extended units from the junkyard will get slotted into the body and bolted to the axle. But when comparing the new shocks to the old, we did notice a difference in the upper ends.
The threads don't actually extend far enough, so time for some washers. And we're going to use a lock nut.
That little fix should work just fine, and we'll tighten the upper ends to 16 foot-pounds by holding onto the outside of the shocks just like we did when removing them.
Thread that gross part towards the Jeep.
Yes, please.
Front is finally back together. We'll set it on the ground and see what it looks like.
And then decide it's not high enough.
We'll lift up under the axle and set it all the way down.
That looks pretty level.
It looks a lot better.
That unibody has a lot of ground clearance, so it looks good with just a little bit of lift.
Despite the springs being from 2 different companies and then the junkyard, it seems like everything worked out because it's sitting nice and flat.
33 3/4, 34 1/4, 33 3/4, and 34 back right.
That's a pretty decent gain in height, especially considering the price for all the parts. Of course though, we're not finished just yet. It sure would be nice to have rear brakes. Ready for day 5.5 of working on the Jeep?
Ready for a lifetime of working on the Jeep?
Apparently. Now we have this bubble flaring toolkit, and hopefully this will make the stupid flare that we need for the ABS module. What we don't have is a new flare nut, so we'll need to cut the one off of the old line and reuse it. That rusty steel line is going to serve as a template for us to bend up the NICOP replacement, and once the new line is cut to length, we'll use sections of stainless steel rock guard to protect it. Rob is under there cutting it between the mounting clips, so we're going to end up with a handful of short sections like this, and hopefully he measures correctly and everything fits correctly.
Nobody's measuring. I'm just eyeballing it.
That's a measurement.
Okay, cool.
Once we have all those sections and the flare nut in place on the line, it's time to flare the front end using our new tool. We'll set the tubing up in the bar using this height gauge, and once everything has been tightened down and the right adapter selected, we'll install the yoke and press down until the adapter is flush with the bar. Then everything gets loosened and the line can be removed. It looks like this 3/16 of an inch tubing was a little oversized for the tool, but the flare should seal fine. To make sure our new brake line is as clean as possible, we'll spray it out with brake clean and compressed air before rolling into the Jeep and getting it into position. Once it's all clipped in, we'll connect it to the intermediate steel line coming off of the ABS module and get the flare nuts nice and snug. At the rear of the car, our new line will get connected to our new extended brake hose, which will get clipped into its bracket and attached to the rear speed sensor wires. And finally, the junction end of the hose can be connected to the lines on the axle, and we can reinstall the breather bolt to hold it in place. With all of that tight, all that should be left is a brake system bleed. And with Rob pumping the pedal, it wasn't long before we had fluid at the rear passenger wheel cylinder.
It's not the worst color I've ever seen.
Once the bubbles have disappeared and the color has stabilized, we'll move to the rear driver's side wheel cylinder, which does just as well. We'll call that good enough for now, at least until we replace those leaking wheel cylinders. Feels really solid, so brakes should be good to go. Should probably bleed the fronts, but the bleeders are really stuck in place. For now, it'll do fine. The last thing we need to do before test driving the Jeep is torque down a whole bunch of bolts. With the suspension at ride height, we'll torque the front trailing arms to 85 foot-pounds, and the front sway bar links will get 70 foot-pounds at the lower ends, followed by 27 up top.
Lower shackle bolt is 80 foot-pounds, upper is 115. We're gonna do 100 and call it good.
We'll also tighten the fronts to 100 foot-pounds. In order to make it easier to tighten down the U-bolts at ride height, we'll lift the axle up on jack stands, and once again, remove the wheels. This also makes it easy to torque the lower shock hardware to 46 foot-pounds. As for the U-bolts, the label they came with calls for 92 foot-pounds. We're gonna go with 80. With the axle secured, all that's left is to put the wheels back on, set it on the ground, and torque all the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. It's been a long journey for what should have been a simple job, but at least we're finally here. Rob's Jeep is officially lifted. I think we'll probably call it a 3-inch lift. And the only thing left to do right now is take it for a spin. Hit the brakes. Oh yeah, not too hard. I forgot how much stuff was in the back. Despite the increase in height, the ride quality and handling are actually better, probably due to ditching those clapped out leaf springs. After a successful test drive, Rob was finally able to bring his Jeep home, and not too long after that it became his daily driver and saw lots of road miles. Oh, and don't worry, the axle brake lines and wheel cylinders did get replaced. It's kinda crazy to remember that this started as an essentially abandoned vehicle that ended up back on the road being so useful. And it's just as crazy how many miles Rob got out of the tires that it was parked on. But, of course, his luck eventually ran out. It's okay though, because we already have a plan involving a poor unsuspecting donor. The Blazer's tires are 31 by 10.5 on a 15-inch wheel, and I'm betting they will be just the right size for Rob's Jeep. I hadn't planned on it happening so soon, but I do have future plans for the Blazer that involve bigger tires, so it seems like as good a time as any to swap these out. And the Jeep is clearly in need of some new shoes.
Oh wow.
Yeah, that was bad.
Dude, these things are so old. These are cracking bad.
You leave my Goodyear Wranglers alone.
The end of 2009, so these are 13-year-old tires.
And on top of that, they look a bit inadequate on this now lifted Jeep. It seems like there's a fair amount of room to work with in the fender wells.
I think it'll be okay.
Good, then this isn't totally stupid.
And once we pull a wheel and tire off of the Blazer, a side-by-side comparison makes it look like this is gonna work. These tires have less than 10,000 miles on them and might actually outlive the body of the Jeep.
Your whole carpet is coming through the floor now.
That's my foot, damn it.
Okay.
We'll go around to all four corners, and once the Jeep's wheels have been removed, do the same for the Blazer. We'll haul those over to the tire shop and were able to get them installed, but we did run into an issue. The Blazer had been doing a lot of sitting recently, and unfortunately this had left some flat spots in the tires.
You could see some run out in them on the machine. It was showing like 5 ounces. So they actually didn't balance these. They took the old weights off and they told us the best bet's just to drive them around and see what happens. We'll see how they do.
We weren't exactly surprised by this or concerned about it being too big of an issue. After all, the tires that came off of the Jeep were flat spotted way worse and rumbled going down the highway, so even without balancing, these will probably be an improvement.
I think that's definitely the right tire size for this.
We'll get all four of those wheels reinstalled and the Jeep set back on the ground.
Oh yeah, it looks good.
Those tires are about 2 inches larger in diameter, which means it raises the Jeep an additional inch. Overall, the fit looks very good. The only points of concern are those front sway bar end links. The pins get very close to the tires when they're turned all the way in. To prevent this from being a problem, Rob decided to go ahead and disconnect the front sway bar, which surprisingly didn't seem to make a huge difference in handling. In fact, in just about every aspect, it feels much better than it did before the lift and big tires. The lack of balancing also hasn't been an issue, to the point where he still hasn't gotten it taken care of, and it rides pretty smoothly down the highway. Of course, it's still rusty and has many of the same problems it did before, but now it's cooler and has even more character, and it's not like it was exactly lacking in that department. Not only is it more custom and more of what Rob wanted from his Jeep, it's carrying on the legacy of another that was left behind. It may not always feel like it along the way.
Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for me.
But driving around in a project that someone else had given up on is one of the sweetest victories of them all.
What do you do?
Yes. Yes.
Ah, my symphony.